Now I'd like to hand over to the chair of the first session, Dr. Andrew Wansley, to commence the first part of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. So yeah, it's with great pleasure that I can ask my colleague, Dr. Haya Al Dajani, to come to the front and present her paper on getting published, or her presentation on getting published. An increasingly important topic within academia. So she's been very successful, so I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas.
Okay.
I'm not sure about being successful, but
Well,
thank you. I guess I can sit. Are you happy if I sit down as well? Is that all right? Yeah, then I'm not in your way. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much to James and Nasser and the committee for inviting me to share with you some, I guess, some tips or some thoughts from my own experiences regarding getting published and also accessing grants. So this is a title that was given to me, so I hope I will do it some justice during the 45-minute session that we have. Because I've got quite a lot to get through, if you don't mind just holding your questions or comments till the end. Usually I'm more than happy to take them as we go through the presentation, but I'm just conscious that we've got to cover as much as possible during the time given. Is that all right? Okay, thank you very much. So to start with then, where to begin with this journey? I liked Simon's comment about being in the twilight zone. Maybe some of us still are in the twilight zone, but it's certainly a good place to start. So for most of you, I guess your first year PhDs, just a show of hands, or second year, first year, okay, second years? Okay, great. Final years? Okay, already. Okay. So what I'll try and do is cover some content to make sure that those who are at the start of their journey in their first year, second year, find this relevant as well. And then those of you who are towards the end of your PhDs, and maybe those of you who've already published as well, can give some feedback in the Q&A session or the discussion at the end. So ideally, really, you want to be looking at the key themes in your work and the sub-themes in your thesis as well. You know that this is probably the largest piece of research you will do for a long time. You know, in many ways, it's a real privilege to have 3 or 4 years to work on a piece of very detailed PhD or research work, because once you are in your academic careers, you'll be managing that alongside so much else. So there is such richness, or there should be such richness in your PhD work and in your thesis, that you should be able to draw out some of those key themes and sub-themes with them quite early on. Review your research questions, your objectives, your conceptual framework. These will most likely have been set at the beginning of your PhD, but by the time you are approaching completion, they might look quite different. There might have been a journey in their development throughout the PhD, so keep revisiting them and reviewing them. This third point about talking to your supervisor and your external examiner too, I think it's a really important conversation to have with your supervisor. In most cases, they are people who've done their PhDs and who have published, and some will have published more than others, but they will have been through the journey. And until you get to the stage with your external examiner, those who are most familiar with your research will be your supervisors, you know, either the DOS or other members of your supervision team. And they also know the area, they also know the literature that's out there. And it's a great way to start your publication journey by actually working with your supervisors to at least get the first 1 or 2 publications from your PhDs. Not all students, and this isn't a criticism for Plymouth at all, but generally when you meet PhD students, at conferences and so forth, so this is universal. Some students will say that their supervisors are not so engaged in their supervision on a regular basis. And the supervisors will be telling you, well, it's your students' research, it's their work, it's not my work. And maybe an area where you can get some of that connection is actually working on a publication with your supervisor. They will be very interested. In terms of the external examiner, I think in many ways we tend to forget about them. We assume that they are people who come in, do the viva, and then they'll disappear. But actually they've been selected because they know the area very well, because of their knowledge around your research. So they're people who you might have cited, they're people who you've read their work, they're people who you'll meet at conferences and so forth. So after the viva, in many ways, they also become colleagues. And in most cases, it will be a positive experience in that you will actually get the successful outcome from the viva. So they become colleagues. And other than your supervisors, it'll be your external and your internal examiners who will have read your PhD in real detail. I think beyond that team of 4 supervisors and examiners, there'll be very few people who will actually read your thesis from start to finish. So get your examiners after the viva, not before the viva, on board with your publication plans. Definitely not before the viva, though. Look out for special issues. So there are all sorts of journals that will be calling for special issues, but also who will have special issues out where they're very focused on specific topics. And sometimes you might find yourselves actually finding a special issue that's so relevant to your work that you end up citing maybe every publication in that special issue. Well, you can also contribute to those special issues yourselves. So think about them too. And then finally, this point about writing an article versus writing your thesis. In some cases, your thesis could be about 100,000 words, whereas an article or a book chapter is between 7 and maybe 10,000 words in most cases. So it's not a case of condensing that 100,000 words or 60,000 words into 7 or 8 or 9,000 words, but rather bringing out the gems from those 100,000 words and focusing on them in meaningful ways for a publication. So although the process is the same in that you're engaging in the research process to produce the thesis or to produce a journal article, the style of writing will be slightly different. It's still academic writing, it's still intensive research, etc. But the way you will communicate the messages that you want to communicate in your thesis or the article might be a little bit different. So beyond that, then, maybe a good place to start is a publication strategy. And those of you who are in the first year or second year might be thinking it's a bit early to do that. These days, in most places, you're expected to not only graduate with your PhD, but with a publication, with some kind of funding, with having organized a conference, with having participated in a conference, and the expectations are really high. So in many ways, getting the publication strategy as early on as possible is helpful, and certainly work with your supervisors on that too. And at the end of the day, what is the purpose of publishing your work, and where do you publish it? So essentially, it's to advance knowledge and inform policy and practice by sharing your PhD research findings and analysis. Okay, that is why we publish. Okay, there's no point to do the research if you're not going to tell the world what you found. And you need to tell the world what you found so that then continues that research conversation or dialogue throughout your discipline. It's not only about journal articles, however. So you can be looking at what I've put down as level 1, sort of more popular media outlets. So maybe doing a blog or doing newspaper articles or doing magazine articles, etc., where you're starting to share some of your findings or some of the issues that you're facing around your research, around your topic, getting involved in those discussions, etc. Looking at Conference papers, actually presenting your work at conferences. It's never too early to start engaging in conferences. Present your work at workshops or at special interest groups or seminars, webinars, etc. It's always good to start actually engaging in your community of interest. Level 3 is book chapters, and some supervisors will be in two minds around this, in that they don't necessarily count towards your referability as such. So some supervisors might be discouraging you from writing a book chapter. It takes time to do the book chapter, just as it takes time to do the journal articles. So, make sure you use the time that you have available wisely. It depends who's inviting you, who are the editors on the book. There might be people who are very influential in your area. It might be a very prestigious book. So in some cases, you might have to, just say, I am going to do the book chapter anyway. They're not, less important. They are just as important, but in some places they don't seem to count as much as the journal articles. Level 4 is then looking at the monographs or the actual books themselves rather than the chapters, participating in a book series as such, looking at editing special issues yourselves, and then journals that are ranked, so either not ranked or ranked at 1 star or 2 star. And then your level 5 are these 3 and 4 star journal articles. So as you can see, there's a whole host of different outlets as such for publication. And within your publication strategy, you might be wanting to combine more than one of these outlets for your publications. You'll hear later in the presentation the whole role of impact and the impact that we're expected to make from our research. And sometimes the impact is not in those 3 or 4 star papers only. They might be in your newspapers, in your blogs, etc., as well as your book chapters, as well as your journal articles. So think about getting a mix of them in terms of an overall publication strategy. And you're not necessarily thinking of a publication strategy for each year of your PhD, but as an overall strategy for beginning to ending the PhD and then starting real life beyond that. And some of you might actually be doing your PhDs alongside working in academic careers. So you're trying to combine both of those as well. So some tips for you. I can't take the credit for all of these tips. I think they're tips that you will hear time and again from different people, but I think the message is consistent. Develop your publication strategy, ensure that that's something that you review every year, engage your supervisory team. Co-authoring is really worth considering. I'd always say in the first instance, consider your supervisors because they're the most familiar with your work, but also look at other people to co-author with too. Look at what material you have, the current trends in the field, and develop the sub-themes that you've got. The work that you have or the research that you're conducting might be really and should be very much at the cutting edge of the area that you're working in because it's very current, it's up to date, it's what's happening now. But at the same time, you need to ensure that it's responding to this discussion or conversation that's happening in your research area. So there needs to be some kind of alignment between those two in order for the publications to go forward. Get the balance between conference papers, journalistic pieces, book chapters, etc. Conference papers are often the starting point for the journal article. So try and get that as finished a draft as possible. Go to the conferences, get the feedback, and then develop that further into your journal article. Engage in reviewing. So you can see then the process from the other side. Often, most of us are engaged in submissions, but not in the reviewing process. And it's not until you start participating in the reviewing process that you actually start seeing both sides of the equation as such. And that can be very revealing in many ways. So contact editors in your areas of expertise, register on Manuscript Central, make yourself available to review and other work and not only be submitting. But then, of course, we've got to remember that all of this takes time. It takes a lot of time. So you need to be organized and also to stay positive. I think as academics, we have to develop a very thick skin given the rejection rates that we experience, either from publications or from applications for funding, etc. So, when something is rejected, then often you've got feedback on how to improve it. So use it as an opportunity to develop the work further and then resubmit it somewhere else later down the line. We saw from one of the slides that James showed earlier, there's already quite a number of PhD researchers in the faculty who are already well published. So speak to them about their experiences, speak to them about the process of the journals that they are successful in, because some journals will be better than others in terms of this time issue. Some journals might turn around the feedback quite quickly, others you might be waiting around for months on end before hearing back from them, etc. Some more publishing tips for you. This isn't me, but I think looks like me on many days of the week, and maybe some of you too. Go to conferences. Journal editors are often there. Okay. When you're at the conferences, don't think about mixing with the PhD students only because you participate in the doctoral days. Certainly do participate with them because they're also experiencing the same journey, but they're also at the forefront of the research area. But also seek out some of the editors who are there. Look out for the journals that you are keen to approach, and look out for editors or editorial team members. Sometimes it's really useful to maybe socialize the paper before you even send it to a journal. Send it to some people either at your university or elsewhere in the discipline area to get some really critical feedback before you even think about submitting the paper to a journal. I know quite a few people are afraid in that they don't want to send their work out because someone's going to steal their idea, or someone's going to get their work, or someone's going to cheat on it, etc. But the whole purpose, I think, is to create this sort of collegial academic network. I'm not saying, post it out for the whole world to see, but by going to conferences, by participating in some of these special interest seminars, workshops, etc., you will get to know who in your area is doing what, who in your area you can collaborate with, etc. And really, use the resource, use the intelligence, use the capital that's created in these networks and contribute to it as well. Some colleagues tend to be tougher than others in their review and in their comments. And I think at the stage where you are writing the drafts as such, use the tougher colleagues to read and comment on your paper, because if you can address their comments, then it's going to be a better paper anyway, rather than go to somebody who's going to say to you, it's perfect, it's great, it's wonderful. They can come later, but at the beginning try and get that really critical feedback. Of course, you have to follow the submission guidelines. And so every journal might have its specific guidelines, and they all tend to be a little bit different from each other. So just ensure that you're following that particular journal's guidelines as closely as you can. And make sure that you're engaged with the current literature. And the current literature is not in the last year or so, it might be in the last 3-4 years, but be up to date on what the actual debates and discussions are in your field to be able to respond to them. And also engage with the relevant debates in the journal that you are approaching. So if you want to publish in a specific journal, have a look to see what's been published in there about your topic, about your area first. If there's been nothing published in that particular journal about your topic, is that really the right outlet for your journal, for your publication? Or should you be looking at another journal that would make more sense for your paper? It can work both ways. On the one hand, you want to be publishing in a journal to be continuing that discussion around the topic. But sometimes, you might be lucky and they say, oh, we've never published about this topic. Here's our chance to do so. I guess it depends on the rigor and the quality of the work that you are submitting. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize these weren't all on there. Okay. In terms of the journal articles, there's, again, in terms of deciding where to go, is your work sort of in an empirical paper? Is it a qualitative paper, a quantitative paper? Where is that more likely to fit best in which journal? Is it a conceptual paper rather than an empirical paper? Are you writing a descriptive case study for that particular work? Or are you writing a research note? Okay, so there are different ways of writing, and there are different ways of finding the correct home as such for that particular type of paper. And then finally, once you've got all that in place, you can start the fun bit of actually writing the paper. And again, this isn't necessarily something that you're going to churn out over a weekend. This will be something that will take quite a while to put together well. And don't forget that it's, again, sort of 7 to 8 or 9,000 words that you're trying to achieve all of this in. So the better structure you have, or the more detailed structure you have early on, the easier the job hopefully will be. So the introduction, why is it that this paper matters? What is your unit of analysis if you're doing quantitative work? What are your research questions if you're doing qualitative work? And what is the contribution that you are hoping to, or you're aiming, not hoping, aiming to make in this particular paper? I know we often call it literature review, but essentially it's a literature analysis rather than a literature review. So you're not simply describing what the previous literature has said. Okay, we all know that, or assume that we all know that, or the people reading those journals, but rather it's a literature analysis. Not only what has the literature said already, but what are the gaps in the literature so far? Because if you're trying to identify the gaps in the literature, that means not only you've read it, but you've actually analyzed it and thought about what's not there. And if you know what's not there in the literature, then you can actually try and bridge that gap by making a contribution through your own work. Okay, so it's really looking at analyzing the literature that's out there, rather than simply saying, I've read the literature and here's what it does say. In the methodology section, you're not only talking about the methodology, but you want to be talking about the method as well. Here is my methodology, but here's what I actually undertook, what I actually did. And often we forget to include a comment about the context of the research. Where did this research happen? There's certainly in entrepreneurship, there are more and more calls to contextualize our research, because we're moving away from the assumptions that entrepreneurship looks the same in any context, but rather, being much more aware about how entrepreneurship contributes to a particular context, but how that context impacts upon entrepreneurship as well. So including a section about the context of your research and making sure that the data there is really up to date and relevant to when you're undertaking your research is important. Analysis of the findings, if you're doing qualitative work, is not about simply reporting, here's what people said or here's what people did, okay? Again, you're analyzing what these results are telling you rather than only reporting about them. If you're doing quantitative work, again, it's not simply about churning out these tables or a series of tables. You want to be much more engaged with the data that you're generating and what it's telling you about those gaps in the literature and what it's telling you or helping you do in achieving the contribution that you're trying to articulate. And in that respect is where you're discussing the findings rather than reporting the findings. And in your conclusion section, it's always about coming back to that contribution. What is the impact of the contribution that you're intending to make in the paper? Does your actual paper, does your actual research and your findings demonstrate the contribution? Okay, so you've set it out in the beginning, but how are you actually showing that you're achieving this contribution throughout the paper? And so you come back to it in the conclusion. And often you find that the conclusion tends to be the weakest section, when you're reviewing papers, because by then, the writers have just run out of steam. So it starts off great in the discussion. Yeah, there are smiles, so you know this. The introduction is great. The literature review is done, the methodology, the results, and then it's like, I've had enough. I'm bored with this, and I can't get on with it. But that is where, it's really important to make sure you have a powerful conclusion. We all know when we're reading, or not reading in detail, but when you're skimming through papers, you tend to read the abstract, you'll read the introduction, then you read the conclusion. If it's a great paper and you like those, you'll go back and read the rest of it. So unfortunately, it's that forgotten middle in many ways at the beginning. So make sure not only the introduction is powerful, but the conclusion is too, so that you've got the attention of your readers to then go back and read the full paper. Limitations, all research has limitations, so don't shy away from outlining them. And on the contrary, I think the more confident you are about sharing the limitations of your research, the better the paper is, because you know what you've contributed, but you also know the boundaries in which you've done so. I'm not saying shoot yourself in the foot and have more limitations than actual findings, because sometimes we tend to do that too. Here's what I found, here's my contribution, and here are all my limitations. Well, if you have all these limitations, how did you actually arrive at this contribution? How did you actually conduct the research? So be aware of your limitations, but also be confident about the research you've done and the contribution that you're making. And future research directions, I think, are a really important section, because that's where we continue the discussion in our particular disciplines or our particular areas. I'm sure you've all been told by your supervisors that when you're reading the research, or when you're reading 3-star, 4-star journal articles, go and look for their future research directions that they have already published there. Because if your research corresponds to some of those future research directions that have already been published, then you're showing how you are contributing to that dialogue, you're showing how you're contributing to that discussion and continuing that research in that area. So highlighting your own future research directions for others to continue with is also really, really important. And I think is also appreciated in the field. So coming back to this point about analysis or review, again, I think those of you who've been submitting and getting review comments back, you might you might sometimes be told that this is too descriptive, that it's not analytic enough. And I think this tends to come with practice. I think we're all guilty of describing because we all want to tell the world what we did, and what we found. And we don't tend to be as good in answering that dreaded "so what" question about what you did and what you found. But certainly the better journals are looking for more analysis than review. So think about whether you're analyzing or reviewing a phenomenon, and then this will help you decide where to publish that particular work. Okay, but more and more what we're seeing is that the reviewing and the description is not the flavor of the month. More and more journals are looking for the analysis. Okay. Okay. Right. This is, some of you will have seen this if you've been involved in the reviewing process already. So these tend to be the typical criteria that reviewers are looking for when they're reviewing your submissions for journals. So does the manuscript contain new and significant information to justify publication? Is there a contribution? Okay. So make sure it's there clearly. Okay. No reviewers want to be reading between the lines to find the contribution. Make that a very clear statement, but then live up to it in the paper. Does the abstract clearly and accurately describe the content of the article? I remember once reviewing a paper, and the abstract looked great, and that's why I accepted to actually review the paper, because it looked really relevant to my area. And then I received the paper, I thought, this can't be right, so I was reading it over and over, and I thought they're two completely different things. So I did go back to the editors, and they went back to the submit, and then apparently they had submitted the wrong paper with the wrong abstract. So things like that do happen. So just make sure that what you write in the abstract is really what's written in the paper, and that they correspond to each other. And I know we always write the abstract first, and then write the paper. But maybe once you finish the paper, go back and rewrite the abstract. Is the problem under investigation significant and concisely stated? So again, we're looking for clarity here. What is it that this paper is trying to address? Are the theoretical underpinnings satisfactorily explained? Again, this is an area where many papers will get rejected, because we're very good at knowing what we did, we're very good at knowing what we found, but what are the theoretical underpinnings that inform this work tends to be quite weak in many papers. So being as familiar as you can, not only with the theory, with the literature, but also with the theories that you are contributing to. Is the methodology adequately explained and sound? Okay. Some papers do that better than others, but at the end of the day, you want to ensure that whoever's reading the paper knows exactly what you did. So if they want to replicate the work in some other context, then they can. And that will be the best thing that could ever happen to your own paper, because then they're going to write somewhere else and hopefully acknowledge your work in their publications going forward. Are the interpretations and conclusions justified by the results? So again, there's this constant thread throughout the paper. Every section has to be linked with the other. Is adequate reference made to other work in the field? That's your familiarity with the literature. Is the language structure fluent and appropriate? You'd be surprised at how many papers just have very poor English and actually get to the review process, but then at that stage will get rejected. The length of the paper, the guidelines, etc. What I should add also to number 7, is adequate reference made to other work in the field. The sub-question here would also be, is adequate reference made to other articles in the journal where you're publishing? Because sometimes you will get to a stage where the reviewers or the editors will come back to you and say, you haven't cited a single paper or article from this journal. Go back and read what's there, and make sure you publish some of that work as well. There are all sorts of reasons for doing that, but that's the way it is. And then once you're sort of responding to the reviewer's comments that you're getting back, recognize that very few papers are accepted without amendment. Okay, in the most likely case, there will be major revisions. In some cases, there'll be minor revisions. In hardly any, you will simply get right fine as it is. So the review process will actually ensure that at the end of the day, you will have a better publication. There are deadlines for minor revisions, and there are deadlines for major revisions, and you've got to make sure that you meet those deadlines. Sometimes, especially for special issues, editors of the guest editorial team are under pressure to make sure that that particular issue is out or is sent to publication by the given deadline. So if you're unable to meet the deadline for your own resubmission, your paper might simply get rejected because you're unable to meet those deadlines. So just be very wary of the deadlines there. Respond to each specific point raised by the reviewers. Sometimes, and those who published will know, that the response that you are sending back to reviewers' comments, that document might actually be longer than the paper itself, But you want to show them that you've considered every point that they have raised and that you have, and how you have addressed that and where you have addressed that in the paper. Recognize that even if the paper is rejected, it's likely to be improved as a result of the review process. Okay, so actually the review process is, in the wider scheme of things, is there for improving and developing all the work that we do. And don't submit a rejected manuscript to another journal without modification. And again, as a reviewer, I remember once rejecting a paper for one journal, and then it showed up 3-4 months later in another journal, and I was still the same reviewer. And I thought, I've read this before, I've seen this before, and I just said, look, I've made these comments in a previous submission. Here they are as they are. So try to take on reviewers' comments so that you don't upset them, and then they're happy with the work that they're seeing. And then just finally on this, just a checklist really. Your publication strategy, is an academic article really the right format for this particular piece of work that you want to share, or is another outlet better for it? If it is an article, which journal would you be thinking about? Think about the structure, think about the content, the way you're presenting, the arguments that you're making, ensuring that you're socializing and revising the work before submission, and then remaining optimistic. Submit it, hoping it will get accepted, but if it gets rejected, don't worry, try again and again and again and again. And eventually you'll get a much improved version that will end up published somewhere. So with one big breath, we then move on to, accessing grants. And the way I read this is that it's about not so much the actual application itself, but where to be looking for available calls to be then accessing what's out there, or first of all, applying, of course, and then hopefully accessing what's there. And I thought a good starting point is really looking at what's available here within the university to all of us, PhD students as well as staff. So we have the Research and Innovation department, I guess, and these 3 people are the specialist advisors, and you can access them through email or have a meeting with them also. And R&I provides advice and support. It's advice research support program, and they also have a university-wide researcher forum, which is really useful if you're thinking about multidisciplinary work. This is something that you can look up on the internet. We don't have time to go into the website itself today, but these are really good pages where you can get all sorts of information about what calls are actually out there, how to write a data management plan, where to go for your costings, etc. There's lots and lots of support, but become very familiar with the link out there. For those of you who are thinking about applying for grants as the first time, the ESRC does offer what's called the New Investigator Grants. Of course, these are really competitive, and they are looking for research excellence, but they're very much geared towards new researchers as such. So you can apply for a New Investigator Grant within 4 years of completing your PhD. Okay, so they are really for newbies as such. So make use of that opportunity. And they tend to range between 100,000 and 300,000 at full economic costing. And I think the ESRC will pay 80% of that. So your university will have to cover the remaining, I think, I'm not sure, but R&I will tell you. And there are no fixed closing dates, okay? So, you know, you can submit whenever you're ready, really. Some practical tips here: identify your funders and the regular calls that come out, you know, year after year. Get designing and writing, as practice makes perfect. I think, you know, it's great to come to these events and to get advice and tips and so forth. But really, I think the best way is to actually do it. You know, give yourself some time to actually do the writing, do the applying, because until you get to that stage, this is just information, you know, so we need to put it to use. Familiarize yourself with the criteria. I'm told I have a minute left, and assess that your positioning as a prospective applicant. Where do you actually fit in terms of your expertise, your skills, your research area vis-a-vis the call that's out there? If you can fit quite well within it, then go for it. If you feel you fit within it somewhat, but there are some gaps, look for co-applicants. Look for co-applicants who will fill those gaps for you. And if you don't fit and your co-applicants don't fit, then that's not the call for you, and go for something else. Complete the sections of the application that you can, even before the calls come out. There are some very standard sections that we all have to do anyway, whether it's your 2-page academic CV or your 10-page academic CV. Make sure that's always up to date and ready. Make sure your data management plan is in place. Familiarize yourself with the processes at the university that would allow you to do your data management and attached processes. All these can be done early on. Think about people that you would want to work with on a grant. You know, talk to them beforehand. What could they contribute to that particular piece of work, etc. Allow time for the peer review, and it's always useful to have the informal peer review, but then the formal also has to take place within the university. And you have to be prepared to work against the clock to complete an application. There's a deadline, and whether it's in 48 hours or 480 hours, it won't shift. So if you're determined to meet that deadline, you're just going to have to put in the hours, you know, and unfortunately, that's the way it works. And network through these professional conferences, associations, etc., because that's where you're likely to find potential co-applicants or collaborators in the future. That's where you're likely to find people who will actually be reviewing later down the line, etc. And I know Richard is doing a session later on networking, right? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so he'll tell you more about that at that stage. Okay. About the application, I think these are fairly common sense. But you've got to make sure that you're responding to the call and the guidelines that are set out in the call itself, okay? It doesn't matter how great the application is. If it doesn't satisfy the call, it will not be accepted. And I think that's sometimes where we are all guilty, in that we think we've done a wonderful piece of work, but we've actually forgotten about the call itself by the time we arrive at submission point. So just make sure you're as clear as possible. Andreas is going to kill me, so I'm going to move on. Letters of support where appropriate. And yeah, okay. Letters of support where appropriate. And these are important, because if you're a new applicant, if you're someone who hasn't applied in the past, if you're not known to the funding agency or to the professional body, etc., you want to give them confidence that you will do the work. So maybe getting those letters of recommendations or letters of support will help the reviewers, will help the funders decide whether you're appropriate or not. I'll move on from impact to make Andreas happy, but this is important. And finally, what they're looking for, happy Andreas, finally, through the application, what they're really looking for is, just hold it up constantly. What the funder is looking for is really a reassurance that you'll deliver the research excellence. Okay, that's what they're looking for. A significant contribution to advancing knowledge, impact on policy and practice, applying a sound methodology and doing so smoothly throughout not only the actual application, but throughout the lifetime of the grant, and that you offer value for money. Okay, so if they're giving you £300,000, don't say I'm going to be a £100,000 budget. No, take the £300,000 and use it to deliver the work that needs to be done. Okay. Do you have time for questions?
Thank you so much, Haya. There's a wealth of information there, lots of really, really useful tips. And kind of thinking back to my own kind of PhD journey, universities are changing clearly, and they are kind of focusing increasingly on the needs of PhD research, and that's a good thing. So sessions like this, thankfully, more we come across them more readily today. 10, 15 years ago, there were few and far between. So thank you again, Haya, for your presentation.